Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to It Takes a Village, the support needed for early childhood development. Thank you so much for joining us for the latest Alumni and Supporters webinar. The alumni community is now more than 285,000 worldwide. It is an incredible global community like no other. I am Kulbir Shergill, Director of Social Inclusion at the University of Warwick, and I am delighted to be hosting this conversation with my esteemed guests. We have an absolutely fascinating discussion ahead, and I invite you to comment and interact in the chat. And apologies for the slight technical hitch on my side at the beginning, for the slight kind of delay in us starting. But I'm really, really excited. We've got a great panel for you today. But at a time when key building blocks in emotional, physical, and cognitive development are established, our early experiences are shaping our developing brain in the most profound ways. But how do we lay the best foundations for positive growth, and what role a community and family can play in supporting children's development? Today, we'll be hearing from our expert panel about their research and their work and experience into these topics. And I'd like to just welcome our guests and ask them to say a few words about themselves, beginning with our alumna, Vivien Waterfield CBE. Vivien, can I invite you to say a few words?
Thank you very much. Yes, hello everybody. As Kulbir said, I'm part of the Warwick alumni community, having spent a very enjoyable and stimulating year at the business school last year, doing a postgrad diploma in organisational change. And in my day job, I'm the Deputy Chief Executive of a national family support charity here in the UK called Homestart. Homestart's a national movement of about 180 local charities, 8,000 volunteers, working in towns and cities and communities right across the UK to make sure that no parent feels alone in that critical role of bringing up their children. We do that, of course, as we'll hear today, because being a parent, joyful and wonderful though it is, can also be tough, especially when you're isolated, when you're far from friends and family, maybe struggling with mental illness, financial worries or other difficulties. And for families like this, it can often become difficult and overwhelming. And Homestart's there to support those families, like I say, in communities around the UK. We work with about 40,000 families a year and 70,000 children. And I think our international friends will be interested to know there are also Homestarts in countries and on continents right across the world as well. So we are not only UK, but an international movement. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivien. I really look forward to hearing more about that work. So thank you for that. And Vivien is also joined by Professor Richard Hastings. Richard, could I ask you to introduce yourself?
Yep, thank you. Lovely to see everyone. So I'm Richard Hastings. I'm the director of a research centre in the Faculty of Social Sciences at Warwick called the Centre for Research in Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. So we focus on children, or our interest in terms of early intervention is children with intellectual disabilities. So before the age of 5, those children are likely to be labelled with a label like global developmental delay, which means they'll have, delays in their development in at least 2 areas of development. And later, they're quite likely to go on to attract the label of intellectual disability. That's the international term. In the UK, we use in the health and care system the label learning disability. So they mean the kind of same thing if you're from the UK and are thinking about that. So children with intellectual disability already have clearly developmental delays as part of the definition of their condition. So they're a priority for early intervention, but there are a couple of other reasons why we will be interested in them in terms of their needs for early intervention. They also experience significant health and social inequalities, typically starting very early in life. So just as a few examples, by the time that children with intellectual disability or global developmental delay are about 3 years old, they already are about twice as likely to have concerning levels of behavioural and emotional problems that would be linked likely to later mental health difficulties. By the time they're age 5, in terms of physical health, just as an example there, about 30% more likely to be obese than children without intellectual disability. And if we think about their exposure to kind of early childhood challenges and family challenges, they're about twice as likely to be exposed to 3 or more social and environmental early risk factors than other children. So they've clearly got needs that require early intervention support, but actually access to early intervention service and support is quite a challenge for this population. So we did a survey before the pandemic now, about 700 families of under 7s with developmental delays, and only about, just under 30% of them had access to sort of appropriate early intervention or support in the preceding 12 months. So access to support is clearly a challenge, as well as the significant needs that they have.
Thank you, Richard. We'll look forward to kind of exploring some of that in a moment, actually. But we're also joined today by Professor Dieter Wolke. So Dieter, can I ask you to introduce yourself? Oh, Dieter, you're on mute. Yeah.
My name is Dieter Wolke, thank you. And I'm a professor of developmental psychology and individual differences in the Department of Psychology here, but also associated with Warwick Medical School. I'm also the member of the management committee of the Centre for Early Life, which is a cross-faculty research centre. And since my graduate studies, I've been fascinated why children develop so differently, even if they grow up in the same family with the same parents. So if you ask yourself, why am I so different from my brother or sister who are raised by the same parents in the same household? So in my research, I focus basically on 3 themes. So firstly, children differ already at birth and shortly after birth in how much they cry, how much they sleep, or how they eat. And one of the questions is, does early regulated behavior, such as being able to stop crying or settling back to sleep when awoken in infants and toddlers, predict still behavior in later childhood and in adulthood? So the theme 2 is really, does being born immature with immature organs like being born preterm affect the development of the brain and emotional and social or cognitive development across the lifespan? And the third area is how trauma or difficult relationships between siblings and peers, that's being bullied, affect mental health, later relationship, employment, and working in teams. So our research is mainly based on longitudinal studies that started in pregnancy or at birth, and we have now followed children into established adulthood. We are particularly interested how the family we are born into, for example, their socioeconomic status, but also their parenting, sibling and peer relationship and their neighborhood may increase the original risk or protect them against it. So we have also developed some interventions and at the moment have randomized controlled trials to test them. And I work together with charities to improve policies on follow-up, for example, on preterm children and assistance to their parents.
Thank you. That is such a great kind of foundation to start our discussions with. So thank you to the panel, and thank you actually for all of the audience today, the participants who've tuned in. Thank you for your questions, and we will try and get through many of those as we possibly can. So I'd like to start off actually with a question for Vivien, and then perhaps Richard could contribute to this, which is thinking about the right infrastructure, and do we actually have the right infrastructure and support in place to secure the bright future for children, whatever their starting point might be? So Vivien.
Thank you, Kulbir. Well, I think if we, any look at this subject, it has to start with the home. Home is where we need to start from. It's parents to introduce children to the world. And it's those first few weeks, those first months and years when foundations are laid, and those early relationships that children have with their parents and primary caregivers that will shape their development, not only now, but well into the future. And as studies show, the research is out there. It's those warm, stimulating, responsive care that's one of the best predictors of children doing well at school and in later life. And when caregivers, when they cuddle, they talk to their children, when they play with them, when they make them feel safe and secure, they're helping to build a really healthy brain and that's wired to interact and to learn. But of course, it doesn't end there, and it doesn't mean we can just leave parents to it. There are so many other things that impact on their ability to be the kind of parents they want to be, and on the children's development. And the well-being of parents is so crucial in a family being able to build those early attachments and those relationships and an environment in which children will thrive and do well. And so it's essential that parents have villages of support around them. And that's why things like high quality, affordable childcare, like properly resourced healthcare and a well-resourced health visiting service are so important. Why children need outdoor spaces, parks to explore and play in, community centres and groups to come along to socialise and feel part of. Why parents need wellbeing programmes. We need support of employers with good employment policies and flexible approach to supporting parents, you know, and adequate housing. All of that is just so important in making sure that families and children can thrive. And those systems really ensure that children from poorer backgrounds as well can also do well. So as well as universal services that need to be available for all parents and all families, we need to also be thinking very hard about the children from less well-off backgrounds who too often start school well behind their classmates. And that's why policies and systems which tackle some of the root causes of inequality and really help narrow that gap are so important, so that children from low-income households can do as well as children from better off households. I was interested, there was a report out this week from Leicester, the Innovation Agency for Social Good, talking about this very subject, excuse me, with a whole series of recommendations on how we can narrow the gap around improvements to the welfare and benefits system, building strong neighbourhoods and a community approach to tackling child poverty, and providing a longer term investment in the wider family support services around children. So there's no silver bullet and there's no one easy answer to this. It really is a question of having support both, you know, in the home to help those parents build positive home environments, but also making sure we have that wider family of support around parents as well.
Thank you, Vivien. So it obviously, you know, many touch points for a developing child, and it's not just what happens in the home, but also externally. So Richard, could I kind of bring you in to perhaps build on some of that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I suppose I might tackle it from the perspective of thinking about what services, what sort of service models might be available. And I suppose there's kind of two answers to the question in terms of whether we have the right infrastructure and support in place for all children. I mean, the first answer is yes, and the second answer is no. So the first answer in terms of yes is really, I think we have the right sort of models and ideas in place in a country like the UK and in other countries internationally as well. So, you know, Vivien's organisation is a really good example, Homestart, and its kind of availability. We have some, and perhaps, you know, starting again a bit more now, kind of family centres, for example, as well, that would support families in local areas. So we have the right ideas, but we've got significant numbers, as Vivien was talking about, of children, you know, growing up in poverty, living in families that are dealing with poverty, huge inequality. And I mentioned our survey that we did actually before the pandemic, and things will have definitely got worse now. You know, thinking about what access families have to support. So we might have the right models, that's the yes, but the no is the access is a really significant challenge. So of the families that we surveyed, they were seeing lots of different professionals often when they had a child with significant early needs of various sorts, mostly developmental and some health concerns. So they saw lots of people, but often that wasn't very well coordinated. I think coordination of services, and especially specialist supports for children who have particular needs, so to cover all children and their development, is traditionally a challenge. So they saw lots of people, but they still also reported significant amounts of what we defined as unmet needs. So that was professionals or services they wanted to see or wanted to get access to in the preceding year, but that they were really struggling to get access to. So there's unmet need, which is significant. And also, as I mentioned, kind of very low levels of access for this high risk kind of group. Remember, and this wasn't just all young children, but a very high risk group. Very few of them were getting actually an appropriate sort of early intervention support for the child or for the family or both together. So that's my kind of no, in that access is a real challenge, and that isn't just a challenge in the UK, that's a challenge in pretty much any country where people have tried to study the sort of access to early intervention and support, especially for children who have significant developmental needs and concerns.
So that's really helpful, just so I can summarise, is that we know what the structure should be, so we have that understanding, we have the ideas, but we don't necessarily have enough of it to kind of actually meet the need that is there. So just kind of building on that, Richard, how do we kind of compare to our European counterparts, our neighbours there, for example? They have different kind of views on school starting age, the role of play, etc. How do we compare?
Yeah, so I suppose the issue here is perhaps not so much, when school starting age might be, but what supports, what opportunities children have and children and families have in terms of kind of support for early development, for learning. I think that's a more crucial question than it is exactly what age it is that we might start school. So in other countries, children start school later than they do in the UK. In the UK, that early curriculum in schools now is much more kind of focused on sort of exploratory kind of learning on different sorts of topics, but also building some academic curriculum, if you like. But it is very much kind of exploratory and play-based. So it's not that different, perhaps, to what young children in other countries might be experiencing, but perhaps not in a kind of more formal school setting. They have their own sort of preschool kind of settings instead. So there's perhaps not huge differences, maybe, in terms of what children are experiencing relatively early on in, especially Western countries, in their in the nature of the support or opportunities that they have, even though school starting age might appear to be kind of quite different. But I did want to kind of reflect on one thing about that more kind of exploratory, less structured early experience, which I think relates particularly to some of the challenges that the sort of children that we're interested in, that we study, who have very significant early developmental delays and might end up with that label later of intellectual disability, or might have associated kind of developmental conditions, maybe like autism. So being in a very unstructured environment and expected to learn is sometimes very challenging for that group of children. So if we have a system that is meant to be kind of more exploratory, play-based and unstructured for all children, it won't necessarily meet the needs of all those children, I suppose, is my point. And that children who need a bit more structure, need a bit more direct teaching to help them learn things and to keep up with their development, may be significantly falling behind as we've kind of tended to shift towards this more kind of exploratory, play-based approach in our early school experience in the UK, and maybe in other countries too. So there may be really good reasons developmentally for thinking about these early processes that are more play-based, more exploratory, less structured perhaps, in terms of general evidence and thinking. But we always have to think about how that relates to the development of all children, as we started with the first question. And I think there is a significant challenge there sometimes.
Slightly more complex. I might just bring Dieter in, actually, if you could just briefly perhaps reflect on that. piece for us, Dieter. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've got experiences of my children having gone, I mean, in Britain and Germany, they would have gone to school at 7 years of age, but in Britain, they go at a much earlier age. But I really want to focus on a particular group, which is the preterm children, because there's a special need. So let's say you have got the cutoff date that you have to go at school at 5 years of age in the UK, and you would have been born in November, but you're born in November. You would have been born in November, but you're born in July, so 12 weeks early. The law till 2014 was that you would have to go at that time to school. But our research showed that it would be beneficial for these children to be delayed to enter the school a year later. But then some charities came up and said, oh, well, we should delay all preterm children. But that doesn't make any sense, because suddenly you delay the children, they suddenly become the oldest and everyone becomes the youngest. So you're just reversing inequity in the school age. And for us, it's more important that children who would be at the right age actually go to school, because one thing that COVID has taught us is if you are in a family which has disadvantage, which doesn't have access to computers, where someone has to go out working, they couldn't support their children very well at home and could nurture them. For them, it was very important to be in school, while professional, middle-class, wealthier families had resources of flexible working, of supporting their families, and we increased more social inequality. So the more important thing is, particularly for those who are disadvantaged, but also for the preterms who would be at the right school age, that they should go to school, but get the right support in school, that they're actually aware that preterms have got more attention problems, they're shy, they need more social support as well as academic support.
So we need to really think much more about how that support, or when's the right age, is very much more of an individual piece as well, that we can't have a kind of blanket approach to children whichever country you're in. So Dieter, if I could just kind of move the conversation on a little, I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about if a child's experiences negative events in their early life, can we kind of minimize that long-term impact? What might be the things that we could do?
I think it's very important to distinguish that negative events may be quite differently experienced, and it really depends on the type of event. So there's some events which are really directed at the child, like, for example, sexual abuse or persistent and chronic bullying. And that is something which the child very often doesn't share with anyone. It's not addressed by anyone else, and they might feel guilty because they can't share it with anyone. And then you have got experiences which are not specifically directed at the child. For example, your parent, the mother or the father, passes away, but there is a sharing of the feeling of bereavement, and there are other people there that you can actually talk with, and depends on how that is managed. And then there are, of course, mixed experiences, like, for example, lots of people in the world go through, like the experience of displacement, immigration. So you can share it with others, but also you're more danger to get directed abuse, like sexual abuse, physical abuse, or being bullied, being different. So the number one importance which we have to do is not to suffer in silence, because that's the biggest problem. We really do need to talk about it. And our own research has shown, and if I give an example, is about chronic bullying. 30% of the children say, I've not told my parents, I've not told the teacher. And we ask, why is that the case? And they say, well, they either say they ignore us, or they basically say, well, toughen up, or they say, all hell breaks loose with my parents. They phone the teacher, they phone the other parents, the headmaster, they want to have meeting. And they say, when my parents are through with this, I have been victimized again. So both being authoritative, just, being tough, or being overprotective are in a way another abuse these children are perceiving. And so it's important that the parents should be open to talk to them, even though they feel there's an injustice done. They need to understand what the child actually needs in that time, and put their own feelings back and say, how can we manage it? The second thing is, we need social support. We're social beings, and if there are other people who can support her, shared experience is very important. It's also important to be empathic. You know, someone has experienced this, but also to be firm. And firm means in this thing, if you try to avoid the situation over and over again, that doesn't help you. It makes it worse. I mean, your mental health problems can become worse. So it's important to have constructive rebuilding, to actually support what the child can do. And I saw, for example, going back to school, lots of children are refusing. It's important to see what the support is there, and to see, like, for example, if they had a bad experience, is to constructively work on the things which they can do well. And finally, and I don't want to go on, we also have to realize, if we had severe trauma, you know, like, for example, sexual abuse or chronic bullying, that it might never go away, also with our best efforts of supporting them, because in our life there may be new triggers which lay this bare. And so you have to think it's a scar, just like a physical scar, which might get inflamed again when we overuse it or it's attacked. Yeah, so it's important to realize that as well.
A really helpful kind of framework there in terms of how, we need to enable children to be able to talk about, you know, the instances that may have occurred, but actually then how we respond to that, and that it's not necessarily for a fixed term period. I'm going to kind of bring in some of the other panel here, and to just talk about actually how extended family and friends may be able to contribute to and support early child development. As we heard earlier from the panel, just the parents, sometimes that's not enough. You know, they're often on a learning curve themselves or needing some support to be able to do that. So Vivien, tell us something from your experience, how you think that wider community can help.
The wider community has got a huge role to play, whether that's friends, neighbours, you know, other services, as we've spoken about, colleagues. I think there's something all of us can do to support parents and provide part of that, what we've described, that village of support. And if we ask parents what it is that they need and what works for them, what they're really looking for is support that is empathetic, someone who will listen to them, who will lend a, you know, give them time and kind of really take on board the difficulties they're having, not necessarily try to fix it all, but just be someone who can who will kind of help recognize and name some of those things, if you like. It's really important, I think, not to bring any judgment to the table. So if a parent does want to talk and share some of the issues that they're facing, it's really important they feel heard and don't feel that someone's kind of judging them. And I think one of the saddest things we often hear is that it sometimes are the parents who can be the most judgmental, perhaps about how another parent is, you know, is parenting, or some of the things that they're going through. So really important for parents that they don't feel judged, but they feel heard, and the kind of support that's kind of built around their needs, that gives them agency, that where they feel they have some control and they have some say in that in that support. So all of those things are really important for parents, and I think friends and family and the wider community all have a part to play in that. And sometimes it's I think we mustn't overlook just the power of sometimes quite small acts of kindness and of support that can make a big difference. So I still remember now a friend of mine from 20 years ago, who the day she brought her baby home from hospital on her own, I went round. I thought I was just, you know, popping in for a quick coffee, and as it happened, she kind of hadn't even thought about how she was going to cope with the night feed that night. So I helped her make up some bottles and showed her how to use a sterilizer and put everything in the fridge for her and things like that. And she still says to me now that she wouldn't have coped without that. Well, we know that she would, of course, she'd have worked it out and she would have been okay. But actually what she was saying there is that she felt there was just the very act that somebody was there for her, and helped really reduce her stress and her anxiety at that time. And she still remembers that 20 years later. So, the power of, a knock on the door on a cup of tea or a meal that someone's cooked, for your neighbour, or a chat in the street and a smile, how are you today? All of those things can feel very small in themselves, but actually are much more powerful than we always realise. And then I think for families who, for parents who don't have family around them, or perhaps who don't feel they can talk to their own family for various reasons, having those adults alongside them who can empathise and just check in on them now and again can be really, really powerful. And the earlier we do that, the earlier we establish those relationships, make those connections, and help parents feel that it's okay to talk about some of the difficulties, not to be scared about it, not to put on a brave face. We see the photographs on Instagram of parents coming home with a baby and getting their figures back after a couple of weeks and all that kind of thing. Not to worry about all of that, not to judge themselves alongside what they think is the idea of a perfect parent, but just to feel space. There is no such thing as a perfect parent. We all know that, really. But to feel safe to have those conversations and to feel heard in those conversations, that's really, really important.
So that whole kind of learning process that can be supported by community for parents, new parents in particular. Dita, what's your kind of view on that? What's the role that community can play here?
Yeah, I mean, it takes a village to raise a child is a proverb that actually originates from the Nigerian Okpo culture. And I want to bring it on a higher level. What has happened is, as we become more high-income countries, we have become much more individualized. So we pay for our services, like getting childcare, we pay for an expert. And before we had a lot of more exchange of social services, like, for example, can you look after my children? I help you with your car, and so on. There was a more informal exchange which has taken place. And what has happened with individualization, that our trust in community and in our politicians has actually reduced, which makes it much more difficult. I'll give an example of my childhood. We had trust in our neighborhood. So if a neighbor told me off because I was bending the rule, I would accept it in the same way as from my parents, and my parents would accept it. Nowadays, you find, how can you tell my child what to do? Yeah, because there's no trust in the community. But we also have to be careful, lots of older members of our society say, in our days, this was all different, it was so much better, having this community. But it's a double-edged sword, because if you're in a society and you're different in your thinking, in your sexual orientation, or in your beliefs, like religious beliefs, if you're in a very shared or collective society, you're much more marginalized, which can happen. And also the second thing is, we looked in our research that those who have more disadvantage use also grandparent more frequently for bringing up their children, because they have to go to work. So grandparents are roped in much more to bring them up. But they use childcare techniques that are 30 or 40 years old. And when we compared them to nursery education, the kids were actually doing worse in their cognitive development. So not everything is good. There's always a trade-off between the two, and we need to reconceptualize in our modern world, particularly in high incomes, what we consider as our community or our village.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, actually, because we hadn't kind of touched actually in terms of actually how has community changed, and how that's kind of impacting actually the support that young parents and young people would have. Richard, I'm going to bring you in here.
Yeah, I might just add a couple of things that perhaps are slightly different, but kind of address the same issue about sort of extended family and friends. I mean, for the sort of families that we are interested in and study and research, then those informal supports from the rest of their family, their extended family in particular, but also from friends and other community organisations and groups, are crucial in terms of their support for their child's development, for their well-being in particular, parents' well-being in particular, I'm thinking of. But those families often have actually restricted networks in relation to kind of informal social support. So it's both crucial, but also more difficult for them to access those supports. So one of the things that a formal sets of services can do and should do, and in many cases do try to do, is to make sure that that more informal nature of support is supported, is boosted in whatever they can do to kind of support that, because families really need it. It's crucial to their children's development. And I wanted to just briefly touch on sort of extended family, especially grandparents, because families of children with disabilities have, you know, significant additional kind of care needs, whatever the kind of disability and where that comes from. And, you know, grandparents can be crucial in terms of practical support as well as kind of social and more emotional kind of support as well that I suppose I was just talking about. So practical support from extended family is perhaps even more significant when you have a child who has got other care needs that require some support too. There is also a kind of additional edge to it. So in our research, it's kind of clear that support, positive sort of support and emotional support from grandparents is good. But of course, there's within families also kind of disagree about things sometimes. So we also have to kind of bear in mind that not everything about kind of the way that families support each other is always positive. Sometimes families, you know, parents have conflicts with grandparents about how you should raise the grandchildren, and that might be especially challenging when you have a child with, you know, additional needs that requires different sort of support, maybe that the grandparents are not used to. So there can be tensions there, which then become, you know, difficult for families to kind of deal with. Not that that outweighs the, you know, the potential, but we always have to be kind of aware that all families work in these different ways, and that there's always another side to family relationships too.
So really important, actually, and I think Dita, you touched on this in actually kind of thinking about the diversity that we're dealing with in our, you know, young children, and actually how that impacts both that interaction with family, but also the need for specialized support that a family may just not be able to kind of, you know, have that experience and be able to kind of provide that for children. Dita, I'm going to keep you on the spot actually there, and I'm just going to kind of move on to thinking about how do we use kind of new technologies and innovations to enable a more integrated approach to supporting children, including the most vulnerable, because I think we've touched on, yes, we know what we need, but we can't always we don't always have the structures in place that, you know, bring the right things at the right time together for young children.
Yeah, it seems that recent media reports that social media and technology gets a really bad reputation, you know, that it is negative and the dangers of it. But however, if we use technology really responsibly, it can help us with a lot of things, also in raising children and also for parents. So if we think of Generation Y, usually 1980s to 1997, and then Generation Z, it's called, from the mid-90s, they all have grown up with smartphones, or at least on computers and so on, using social media. So they're using it every day, they use it in their work, they use it privately all the time. So if they've grown up with that, they are also now the people who are reproducing, who are having children. So we can utilize this new technology and their knowledge of the technology of how to do this. And one of the things we have done in our research is, when I looked at antenatal classes, they mainly focus on the 24 hours of birth, yeah, on the delivery and it's natural and how it happened, and maybe on breastfeeding. But you have got 50 years ahead with your child or something. They don't focus on what happens after the child is born. And particularly the early phase, they do cry, they have got colic crying. it can drive you nuts. They don't sleep through the night. It's difficult to introduce solid foods and so on. So what we did is we got actually in Bavaria, in Germany, we got a grant from the health ministry in that state to develop an app together with the pediatricians there and with us, to give parents the possibility to look up, to keep a diary about crying, to look up what is normal crying, what is normal sleeping, what intervention can I do, and if I can't get on, which health services are in my local area, they could detect it. And we evaluated this in a randomized controlled trial, and we actually found that they found this very helpful, significantly helpful, this knowledge to get, and it really helped them to cope and also their relationship. And we're developing it further so that it can be rolled out to all of the parents in Bavaria. They get it automatically in the clinic when they're discharged to use this particular app about crying and sleeping. So that's just one example where it can be very helpful and very useful for a generation that's used to use it. But we also know about other tools developed for children and adolescents. And some 10 years ago, we got a grant, a European grant called eCircus, and we developed a virtual reality that someone who is being bullied in school can try out different alternatives of how to deal with it. I mean, do I fight back? Do I tell the teacher? Do I suffer in silence? What can I do? Yeah, how can I do it? And to develop problem solving in these particular situations. And again, we showed that it reduced victimization in these children over the next 6 months because they had more skill. So I stopped there, but there's a variety of ways of using technology, particular for a technology literate population.
I think that's kind of quite fascinating, isn't it, that we have grown up with this generation who are quite used to this and actually may even prefer to kind of interact with technology to get their advice and know where to go and what to do in a way that maybe isn't always easy to do with a parent. You know, we pointed out that sometimes you don't always get the right reaction from both parents or, you know, others in terms of how you might respond. So I'm just going to kind of move on a little bit and I'm going to kind of come to Vivien, actually, if I may. If you could briefly just say to me how you think that the mental health of either both parents, either or both parents may actually impact on the growth and mental health of a child.
It's a really important question. And I think we're understanding more and more and better about how, you know, particularly during pregnancy and just after birth, how the mental health of parents, both mothers and fathers, can be impacted in those first few months and years in a way that is can have a real impact on the children. You know, whether that be, you know, struggles that they have around anxiety or depression, or more serious issues such as postpartum psychosis. And I think the work that organisations like the Maternal Mental Health Alliance and the 1001 Days movement, of which we're at Homestart, we're a coalition partner, the work they've done to raise awareness and understanding of this particularly critical period has been really, really helpful in moving forward the kind of conversation and also the development of services for those parents. But I think there's still a long way to go. I think we know that perinatal mental health illness affects about 1 in 5 women, but 7 out of 10 don't feel able to talk about it. So very often those issues go undiagnosed, and women will, and men and dads will hide and will underplay the severity of those of their illness, and maybe they don't feel able to acknowledge it. Maybe they don't understand it themselves. Maybe they're worried about being a bad parent or being judged to be a bad parent. But of course, what happens if it isn't addressed, if they aren't supported, then they can really struggle, I think, with just the day-to-day challenges and exhaustion of parenting. Depression may mean that they've got very low energy. They may be over anxious as a parent. They may struggle to form a close attachment with their baby, which we know is so important in their first few weeks and months. they may struggle with their own moods and emotions around the children. And you know, although I think it's important to say that parents with mental health illness can care for and support their children in a very loving and safe way, it's really important that they get help. We get that help early enough before those issues really escalate, so that any impact on the children can be minimised. And you know, we know that can work. You know, with the right kind of support services, you know, whether it's at that kind of social support, you know, at one end of the scale, or if it's actually you know, making sure parents get referrals into specialist counselling and support if they need it. All of that is absolutely crucial and really should be part of that universal package of support available to parents in those first few weeks and months.
Thank you, and perhaps links to some of Dita's earlier points around actually how we might adapt technology again to help parents as well in terms of accessing that and kind of getting over that stigma. I think there's always such a huge pressure on parents, you know, to be that kind of perfect parent. And I think if you're dealing with mental health issues yourself, it's a kind of real double-edged sword there. Richard, could I kind of bring you in on that in terms of how, you know, how mental health of parents may impact on, you know, the mental health of a child?
Yeah, I suppose a couple of things I'd quite like to add to what Vivien's already kind of eloquently described. So one is that obviously it helps to think of families as systems. So you know, they're one type of system. Obviously families can be very different, but essentially whoever's in the family, you know, there are individual influences on each other, but also a number of subsystems. So Dita mentioned siblings earlier, and we've got sibling relationships, we've got couple relationships if there's more than one adult in the family, there's different parent-child relationships. And of course, everyone influences each other. So it's not simply about the parent's mental health being something that drives children's mental health over time, but actually, you know, that can occur in the other direction, but also, you know, perhaps, for example, a sibling of, you know, a child who's kind of struggling with their mental health is going to influence both their parents, you know, the parents' relationship, their relationship with their brother or sister, they're going to influence their brother or sister. So all of those interacting factors are really crucial to think about in terms of people's mental health and well-being. So not necessarily just always kind of parent to child, but family member to family members, family subsystem on family subsystem is crucial, I think. And I suppose the other thing I wanted to kind of mention, I guess, is that at the same time as the point I've just made, parents' mental health is crucial in terms of, you know, driving some aspects of children's development, either increasing kind of risk for poorer outcomes for children, or you know, potentially if it's kind of positive well-being, you know, helping to kind of improve chances of positive outcomes. The key question is how and why that happens, and there are some good kind of theoretical ways of thinking about that, which suggests that, you know, if parents' mental health kind of help in part determines that the capacity they have to parent in different ways, and also determines in part their capacity to invest in their children, doing the sort of usual things that help children's development and the usual practical day-to-day things that influence children's development. But there are kind of big factors that affect parents' mental health. And we've already talked about a number of times, and it's probably important to really emphasize how powerful the effects are. You know, families, individuals living in poverty is a massive driver of mental health. And therefore, then that has a trickle-down effect, if you like, in terms of development on parents' mental health, then on their parenting, then on kind of children's outcomes. And you know, there's good data to suggest that pathway applies basically for all children. So yes, children have different complexities of different needs, but in our research, children with intellectual disability, in terms of their outcomes, especially their mental health outcomes, are influenced by that pathway of sort of trickle-down effects in the same way as children without intellectual disability. So that focus on supporting, as Vivien was talking about, parents' mental health, but perhaps all mental health of different family members, is a crucial thing for intervention and support. It's not always directly about, you know, directly intervening with a child who has some needs for early developmental support in terms of early intervention, but some early intervention can be about strengthening the family, improving mental health of different family members.
I think that's such an important point, actually, Richard, that it isn't always kind of the parent, that actually siblings' kind of mental health and an emotional kind of state can have a huge impact on children who are growing up in the same family. And I was also thinking that, you know, quite often we see that children end up being carers for parents. So there's some very practical issues here involved as well. Dita, I think we're kind of coming towards the end, unfortunately, towards the end, but I'm going to squeeze this last question because I think it's really important for us, which is how can we support premature babies to ensure that they develop just as quickly as their term friends?
Yeah, I think it's important to break down this question. I know that Richard also used the term developmental delay. And it's very important, as I understand developmental delay, it means that they're just behind, but at some time they will catch up. That's the term delay is there. And what we have actually found, if I just define prematurity, that's children that are born before 37 weeks gestation, at normal gestation is 40 weeks. And the highest risk groups is the children who are born more than 8 weeks early, like before the 37th weeks. And what we actually have is that most of the preterm children, over 50%, develop quite well within the normal range. But then we have got a group of 25% who early on, so like, for example, what you would call delay at the beginning, you would say they're delayed in their like 3 months, 4 months, and they've got a lower developmental index. And we followed them up into adulthood. And we actually found the group who were severely delayed at 2 years of age still had IQ differences in adulthood, and they had not narrowed. So we can't talk about delay, but we have to talk about impairment. And I think we need to be very clear about this. And we usually can identify them with severe delay, which I would call impairment, by 2 to 3 years of age. And what that means is we can't get them to develop as quickly, but we have to manage parents' expectations and we have to provide support to increase quality of life. And then you have got 25%, which are in between, you know, the normal range and the ones which are sort of severely delayed and impaired. And a lot of these children can actually develop quite well. We have shown that if they are born, for example, in a family of higher socioeconomic status, they do much better. If they have got parenting which is much more sensitive, who have go to a school that actually looks at their needs and supports them, they can catch up to the normal range. So we have got the variety of impairment where we manage expectations and focus on quality of life and give the right type of support for all at the family. For those 25% of the very preterm, where we actually give support that they can reach in the normal range, and 50% actually need not as much. The parents were very distressed, and very often the parents need help because everyone is very distressed. If you suddenly end up in a neonatal intensive care unit, you wanted a healthy baby, but this one is in the incubator, needs ventilation.
Thank you. That's really helpful to kind of finish off on that one, which we've touched on actually during our conversation, which is also the issue around how equality, whether it's social equality or economic equality, actually impacts on the development and the chances of what interventions may be made. Thank you. That does actually bring us to the end of our questions, and I know that we could carry on. There's so much more to kind of delve into. So, you know, I just would like to perhaps just bring a few threads together, and it seems to me that what we're very kind of agreed on is that it certainly takes a village to kind of raise a child and to provide that kind of warm and nurturing environment. And we know what that village should look like, whether we call it a community or something else. We know what it looks like, but I think we're also kind of agreed that actually we don't have everything in place in terms of how and in what combinations people may need it, and children may need it as well as the families, but also perhaps being able to flex that so that we can be providing a much more individual you know, much more kind of individual care and education for the children, because they are diverse and you know, their levels and pace of development are going to be very different, whether it's because, you know, they're kind of premature or because of other kind of family circumstances, that we really need to be able to kind of shape that. So it certainly takes a village, but it's slightly more complex than just saying that, because we know that the village has changed as well, and it's thinking about actually how do we really kind of recreate that for now, whether it's using technology, which clearly is having such a beneficial kind of effect for people and young children, and we're looking at new ways of actually how we can do that. So I'd just like to kind of say that thank you, really, all of you, very much for sharing your invaluable insights to our audience, for the questions which have really helped to kind of shape our discussion, and for joining us online. Just a little bit of kind of information to finish with. There is some information on the screen that you'll find of resources that you may find helpful. So thank you so much for joining us. Do share the recording of the session today. Please do share that with people who may be interested. And you can stay connected by scanning this on your screens, and we'll be able to kind of connect with you as well. So thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing you at a future session. Thank you.